Hello, BookTube. We're back after a bit of a delay to this impromptu library tour. We're doing biographies. And we did the big bookcase that's mostly British royalty, but now we're on to there's a transverse bookcase here that runs underneath the sill of the windows along the wall. The windows don't face anything aesthetically interesting, and they are, of course, a heat suck in the winter. And, of course, the winter is now 11 months long in Boston. Today is a dark, rainy, freezing cold day in Boston. On the doorstep of June. It's the last week of May, so this isn't going to stop. I had a vacation from Boston just recently to go to Vermont, and it turns out that was also a vacation from winter. I come back to Boston, and I'm back in Boston, and then winter is back. So I don't really... I mean, it's been a long time, and I've had these windows. I don't really care anymore if I block one of them with a tall bookcase, so that I don't have to do, because of course I've got a low transverse bookcase here. So the natural result is that over the years there become piles of vertically placed books on top of the books on the top shelf of that bookcase, and I'd rather have those all in a tall bookcase. I went looking for a tall bookcase in Vermont when I was vacationing there just this weekend. It was on my list, tall wooden bookcase, because I was going to have access to a car to bring it back here, and I didn't find one, which means my Vermont vacation was a failure. But maybe I'll find one in Boston. You never know if the weather ever lets up. In the meantime, the reason I'm mentioning this is because when I do these bookshelf tours, I always start with the transverse books, the ones that you inevitably put sideways on top of the others in the space between the top of the books and the next shelf up. I say inevitably, but of course I've seen a lot of BookTube channels where the bookshelves are there for, I almost shudder even to say it, they're there for decoration. They have large alphabet letter statues on them, or plants, or open space, or crystal balls, or whatever. My bookcase is all crammed with books. That's what they're there for. That's why I got them. And if we're going to start with transverse books this time around, we're going to have to start with these tall pylons of books because I can't get at the ones underneath them. So this is going to take us quite some time. You don't seem to mind these bookshelf tours, so I'm warning you ahead of time, this is going to take us some time, but it's not going to matter to you. So we're going to do the first stack of transverse books. The whole stack is transverse books, and then I guess maybe what I'll do is just do all the others, and then I'll put them on the floor because that'll help to rearrange them. I'm rearranging and sort of assessing these books as I go along, and that's very helpful. So maybe I'll do that. I'll just put the transverse, the stacks of books on the floor, and then not only will that help me to look at them and assess them and whether or not they're doubles or whether or not I want them or whatnot, but it'll also free up the top shelf of the transverse bookcase itself for a bookshelf tour somewhere down the line. So we're going to start with this first column. Won't be many books. I say many, it's a whole shelf full of books, but it won't be many compared to the others, and we'll just keep doing that. So the first one on this transverse pile shouldn't be here. The first one that I encounter should not be here. It is not, strictly speaking, a biography. It's a study. And as much as I love them, and as much as a lot of the ones that I love most are biographically oriented, they are not biographies, so they don't go here. And this is by a study of Lord Byron. This is by Lewis Crompton, and it is Byron and Greek Love. Homosexuality in 19th century England. And it's a whole book, despite Byron's best intentions and the best intentions of a lot of his well-meaning friends who destroyed tons of letters. Of course, his publisher destroyed his memoir, and he himself went through a lot of his paperwork and destroyed things that had once struck him as courageously brave writing. And almost all of that revolved around his homosexuality. That the standard line in Byron biographies, I can't remember if we've hit a Byron biography yet, but the standard line in those biographies is that it was his scandalous affair with women, and specifically his sister, that eventually, to use the old phrase, made England too hot to hold him, that drove him out of England, drove him into voluntary exile, rather than spend his days in England being socially scorned, which meant a lot more then than it does now. If you were walking in Mayfair and you were cut by somebody and you were Lord Byron, that was a major thing. That's all anybody would talk about for weeks in town. So the standard line in Byron biographies is that he left town because of that, because of those scandals. I have never believed that. I think there's ample evidence, even from the scanty amount that remains, that the thing that drove him out of England was a fairly unrepressed homosexuality. I think Byron would be, in our 21st century parlance, I think he would be termed bi. He would be the B in LGBTQ. Even, and that's what this book is all about. This book does about as thorough an examination of that subject as you could do with the sources that we have now. So I really like it. I go back to it all the time. I kind of wish, I don't think that it's going to survive another rereading from front to back. I kind of wish that I could find this in a hardcover, but I'm happy the trade paperback is nice and clean. Okay, speaking of nice, clean trade paperbacks, this is an example of something that I've talked about on this channel, how kind of, sort of, I mean, it's joyful, and we all know that. You all love it, so do I. It's joyful to buy used books. It's joyful to go hunting. I spent the whole weekend doing that. But it's kind of sort of crazy for me to do that, because I get a ton of books in the mail every day, and they're not all, floppy paperback ARCs of brand new books. Quite a few publishers are engaged in reprinting, and you never know where that's going to go, what shape it's going to take. Granted, it probably affects biography less than any other. Biography is my favorite genre, and it gets, the oldies but the goodies get reprinted a lot less often in biography than virtually any other genre. But this came in the mail. That's the reason I'm thinking of it. This came in the mail just recently. This is Doris Kearns Goodwin's book on Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson and the American Dream. That was just, I think it still has a pub sheet in it. It was just, this was March 2019 that the publisher decided to reprint this. Not only because Doris Kearns Goodwin has a book of presidential, American history meditations out on the market, but also because since 2016, the American book publishing market has been bottomlessly hungry for stuff on presidents. I think probably predictably it has been. So a lot of those things have been greenlit. A lot of those things have been pushed up. I think in 2020, just in time for the next presidential election, we can probably expect an absolute bumper crop of presidential biographies of all kinds. That'd be amazing. Of course, I love reading them. That'd be about the only amazing thing about the 2020 election. As the 2020 election is either going to have the worst president in American history reelected, or it's going to have the worst president in American history calling on a sizable portion of the country to ignore the election and call him president anyway. It's like you're driving down, an international state highway, and the road is in front of you and the blue sky is above you, and you can see fields on either side, and you're looking at the other cars, and a light on your dashboard pops up, and you look at it, and it says, in 2.2 miles, you are going to have a head-on collision from which you will not survive. It's like that. It's exactly like that feeling looking at the 2020 race. So and I'm sure that's part of why this book was reprinted. It's really good. I myself think that Lyndon Johnson was a thoroughly political creature. I think his biography can be written in municipal, state, and national politics, and even presidential politics. The parts of his life before politics are just untrammeled brutality. Just horrible, horrible things that he did. He was a horrible, horrible person. The things that he did to animals alone in the years before he found politics as a way to partially channel his inherent savagery would curl your hair. But because he's an inherently political creature, I have never really particularly liked biographies of him that are soup to nuts. I much prefer, this is much more a policy biography than it is a personal biography, and I much prefer that. And when you talk about that, by far the greatest book on Lyndon Johnson is Master of the Senate by Robert Caro, who had originally planned to write the whole of Johnson's life in biographical volumes, just like George R.R. Martin had originally planned to write the whole of his story of A Song of Ice and Fire. As we've mentioned on this channel before, the first and most important prerequisite of writing a book is writing a book. Talking about it, writing a book in which you talk about writing it, going on lecture circuits, telling your assistants that you're just not up to it today because in 2 weeks you have a dental appointment, is not writing your book. Not writing your book is not writing your book. Talking about writing your book is not writing your book. Only writing your book is writing your book. And if you don't write your book, you will never write your book. Now, all of that sounds so grammar school, simple. And yet, there are plenty of authors, and not just new ones, who seem not to know it. When you listen to Robert Caro doing interviews now for his book, which is incredibly ironically titled Working, when you listen to him do interviews, it sounds like he is doing this book because he's impatiently waiting for the draft of his next Johnson volume to be delivered to his office. That's exactly what he sounds like. He sounds like, well, I had the time on my hands because he's this dang Robert Caro guy just won't get me his manuscript. So anyway, his book, Master of the Senate, is LBJ not only as a political creature, but at the absolute pinnacle of his political power before the presidency. And this is a good adjunct to that. When I got it in the mail, I knew I wanted to keep it because Doris Kearns Goodwin has a much more personal connection to LBJ than Caro does. But anyway, so this does technically belong here. You might be saying, well, if the Byron book is a study, then surely a political study of LBJ is also a study and doesn't belong with biographies. But my opinion would be that Johnson was such a political creature that political studies of him almost count as biographies. Okay, all right. This next one is Anna Beer. This is Patriot or Traitor: The Life and Death of Sir Walter Raleigh. I really like this. I thought it was really good. I kept the advanced copy. I had a couple of finished copies. I think they went out to some of you. And now I'm glad that I kept it. I'm glad that I held on to it. I liked it anyway, so I kind of thought that I would keep it. But it turns out there's another Sir Walter Raleigh biography coming out this year, coming out soon. And that's always fun when you get two new biographies because they're going to have different viewpoints, different authorial agendas. I'll be rereading this one when I'm reading that one. I know I will be. Okay, all right, this next one does belong here. It is not a study, believe it or not, but it doesn't belong right where it is. It belongs on a shelf with American presidents. I've mentioned this book before. I think it's fantastic. If you ever see it, it's not likely, but if you ever do, you should grab it if you're interested in the subject. This is Harold Hoser's book on Lincoln, President-Elect. This is a big, fairly hefty book on Lincoln in between when he won the election and when he was installed in the White House. Now, it sprawls in all directions. It isn't just that, of course, but Harold Hoser is one of the best thinkers on Lincoln, one of the best writers on Lincoln that I have ever read, and I've read them all. He gets the guy, warts and all, in a way that so many of his other biographers don't, that I'll take any book on Lincoln that he does. I wish talk about working, I wish that now in his golden years he would write a 1,000-page biography of Abraham Lincoln, start to finish. I don't think he's ever done that. I will kick myself if he's done that and I haven't read it. But I don't think he has, and I would love that. That would be the Lincoln biography for the ages. And maybe he will. You never know. Okay, this next one doesn't belong here. This is, granted, a series of biographical sketches, but it's mainly history. It belongs on the history shelf, and we've seen it. This is the Dukes of Britain. And there is one of them that a particularly unfortunate duke, as you can see. I guess dukes have tragedies too. But this is just a series of potted little glimpses of modern dukes, the modern holders of dukedoms, and this was 30 years ago. And it doesn't count as biography, even though it's set up as a series of potted biographies. It still doesn't count because access to those dukedoms and those dukes and their personal schedules required a signed contract to airbrush what you found. So that doesn't do. That doesn't work, even though there are quite a few authorized biographies on these shelves. I still think, I have often maintained that authorized biographers find a way to give you the dirt on their subjects, almost always. You usually do a heavy amount of reading between the lines, but it usually is there. But not this. No. So this is good. This is very good. I will just make a pile of these things and just reassess them, that's helpful to do. Okay, all right. This next one is James Anderson Wynne. He's a great guy, and he's a fantastic writer. We've already seen him. We saw his book on Queen Anne. And this is a masterpiece of his. Still, by far and away, the best book on the subject. It's John Dryden and His World. This is a big Yale trade paperback. I could definitely go with a big Yale hardcover of this. Every once in a while, I almost think I'm seeing one at the Brattle Bookshop, and then I don't. Or I see it and I don't bother to get it. And that's got to change. This is everything This is everything about Byron, and it's written. Wynne is such a fantastic writer, such a fantastic biographical writer, that it's the one to have. I don't think. Well, it doesn't have a whole lot of competition. It's John Dryden, after all. Only about 5 of us in the world consider him to be unbelievably good or unbelievably important. But I don't think I have any other Dryden books of any kind, even Dryden studies. I don't think I do. That would be a shame. Okay, and then the last 2 transverse books this time around are enormous. The first one is Charlton Ogburn, who you really ought to hear. If there's, I wonder if there is YouTube footage of him speaking. As a speaker, he's quite interesting. But this is his book, The Mysterious William Shakespeare. The Myth and the Reality. This is a big seminal work of, when was this? This was 1984. 1984 is when this book came out, and it's just one of the seminal works on the whole Shakespearean authorship controversy. One of the whole, you have a Shakespearean authorship controversy, then you are almost contractually obligated to try and solve it. It's not enough for you to line up and the evidence and say, all right, well, here is what we know of the biography of William Shakespeare of Stratford-on-Avon. And when you match that against William Shakespeare's literary life, there isn't a whole lot of overlap. There are all sorts of serious questions that arise. I know that some people, even on BookTube, have very vigorously objected to my statement that anything like that is true, and I love that. I absolutely love those rebuttals. Nevertheless, I don't think there's any way to avoid it. There is a massive disconnect between Shakespeare the man and Shakespeare the artist, in a way that does not exist for any other artist, even in his own, by our standards, poorly documented age. And when you notice that, if you're a scholar or just a passionate reader of Shakespeare, when you notice that, your first instinct is to say, well, that's just lacuna in the records. Of course, William Shakespeare wrote William Shakespeare. And then your second instinct, if you're the suspicious, Aloysius sort, is to say, all right, well, maybe he didn't. And then your third instinct, which should always be resisted, it should always be resisted, and it never is, because there are books to be written, there are contracts to be bought. Your third instinct is to say, well, if he didn't, who did? And the minute you put a candidate forward, you have stepped firmly into tinfoil hat territory. And they all are. All these things are, because there are no candidates that don't have even more serious impediments than William Shakespeare himself. And if you're going to do that, if you're going to step in and say, well, I have a candidate, for who wrote the plays and poems of Shakespeare, but in order for my candidate to make any sense, I'm going to have to do this bit of gymnastics and that bit of gymnastics and the other. Well, then why not just do those gymnastics for William Shakespeare of Stratford-on-Avon? He needs them too. Why not just stick to the home team if that's what you're going to see? Especially since we have plays with his name on. We have, printed plays with him attributed as the author. So if the evidence goes that far towards him and you have to do gymnastics anyway, why not just stick to him? But they don't ever do it, and neither does Ogburn. He doesn't do it. He has a candidate, as you can tell. He has a candidate for Shakespeare, and just goes on at enormous length. This is an oversized hardcover, and it's delightful. These books, most of them are delightful to read. Even if you end up not believing a single bit of them, they're still delightful to read. And then this last one's a big, ornate, wonderful old thing. When did this come out? This has to be 100 years old. This is just the sort of thing you get at the Brattle that you don't get. Okay, yes, this was published in 1913 by Small Maynard and Company, which was a Boston publisher. I know exactly the building that they used to be in. And this is by Philip Hale, and it is Vermeer of Delft, a big, gigantic biography of the artist, which has black and white reprints of all of his work, and then just enormous amounts of biographical nattering and whatnot on him. This bit of sun damage was there before it came to me. This is an oversized book. Obviously somebody had put this on a shelf with normal size hardcovers in direct sunlight. These things are all at an angle, directly edge on to the sun, so they're not accruing any they're not incurring any sun damage here. But I would still like a tall bookcase. I would very much like it if my Vermont vacation had not been a failure. But anyway, so that's it for this particular first transverse thing, and as long as you're all interested, I will just go through the transverse books and I will make piles on the floor so that I can analyze them and maybe figure out better places for them to be, or whether or not they need to be destroyed. And then we'll do the bookcase itself, and then we'll move on to another bookcase, which has another transverse nightmare. So this could go on forever. You don't seem to mind. You let me know if you do. And we'll move on to science fiction or whatever. But the rest of the place is just as big of a mess. The big, wonderful soup to nuts reorganization that I was going to do here really can't happen fast enough. I really wish that Steve Donahue person would get around to doing it. Anyway, I will wrap this up for now, but I will see you soon. Thank you, BookTube.